This is Elena from Mirrix Looms. Today I'm going to show you how to warp a Mirrix loom for bead weaving, both with and without the shedding device. Let's get started. To get started warping for bead weaving, you'll need a Mirrix loom with wooden clips, a warping bar, a spring bar, a flat wrench, a warp coil, and, if you'll be using the shedding device, a shedding device handle, and Allen wrench. Additionally, you will need some kind of thread to warp your loom with, either a beading thread or cord, a measuring tape, a good pair of scissors, and, if you'll be using the shedding device, Hetals. To get started warping, you will first place your loom on a flat surface by folding out the 1 or 2 fold-out legs on your loom. The next thing you will do is take your warp coil and place it in the tray on the top of your loom. If you have a bottom spring kit on your loom, this is the time when you will also place a matching warp coil on the bottom of your loom. To put the warp coil on the top of your loom, simply loop one end of the warp coil to the brass piece on one side of the top of the loom and the other side to the other brass piece, like so. The next thing you will do is set the height of your loom. You want to make sure that there are at least 4 inches of threaded rod covered by the copper on the smaller looms and 6 inches on the larger looms. To adjust the height of your loom, simply turn the wing nuts on either side of the loom in a counterclockwise direction to raise the loom and in a clockwise direction to make the loom smaller. Make sure you measure to check that your sides of your loom are both even. Now you want to take your wooden clips and turn them backwards on the loom. So the long part with the indentation is facing the back of the loom. Make sure that the white plastic screw is at the back of the clip. You can use this screw to tighten your wooden clips onto your loom. Make sure that your clips are at the same height on the loom. You can measure to check. Now, take your warping bar and place it between the wooden clips. You can see there's an indentation in each clip to hold the warping bar. You may need to push your clips in slightly to securely hold the bar. The pattern of warping is very simple. What you will do is wrap your warp around the outside of the loom. Every time you hit your warp coil at the top of the loom, you will place your warp in a dent in the warp coil. A dent is a space in the warp coil. You may be warping with your warp in every dent or every other dent, depending on how far apart you want each of your warp threads to be from the one next to it. We will begin by tying our warp thread onto the warping bar. Then we will begin wrapping around the loom, going from the warping bar in the back of the loom, down the back of the loom to the bottom beam. Bring the warp from the back to the front, around the bottom beam, and then up the front of the loom from the bottom. When we hit the warp coil, we will place the thread in one of the dents. Now we will bring the thread from the front of the top beam around to the back and then begin going down the back of the loom. Now we've wrapped all the way around the loom, but when we hit the warping bar, we're just going to do a U-turn around it and come back in the direction that we came. So we've looped around that bar, and now we're coming back up the back of the loom to the top beam, from the back to the front, into the next dent in our warp coil, down the loom to the bottom beam from the front to the back. So again, we're just wrapping around the loom, back up, and then when we hit this warping bar, we're going to do another U-turn and come back down the direction that we came. This is the pattern that we will keep repeating until our piece is as wide as we need it to be. I will repeat this pattern one more time. I'm coming down from the warping bar on the back of the loom. And now I'm just wrapping around the loom. When I hit the warp coil, I'm going to place my thread in that, keep wrapping around the loom, but when I hit my warping bar, I'm going to do a U-turn around that and come back the way I came. Now, once again, I'm just wrapping around the loom, just like this. Now, it's important to remember that you want to keep even tension on your warp thread as you are doing this. So don't drop your warp and go answer the door or have a conversation with somebody. You don't need tight tension because the loom will tighten your tension for you, but you do want to make sure that it is even. So we've continued to wrap around the loom, and then when we hit the warping bar, we're just going to do a U-turn and go back in the same direction. One thing you want to check is because you're warping around the outside of your loom, your warp thread is never going to cross through the center. So sometimes you may want to just put your hand right in the center of the loom to make sure you did not accidentally do that. You want to really concentrate on what you're doing as you warp to make sure you don't make any mistakes so you don't have to go back. So again, we're just wrapping around the loom, and then when we hit the warping bar, coming back the direction that we just came from. It is as simple as that. I'm just going to show a close-up here of what it looks like when you do a U-turn around the warping bar. So we hit the warping bar and just come back down the other direction. And then we've gone under the loom. You can see in a little more detail here what it looks like to place our warp in the warp coil around the loom, and then again do a U-turn around that warping bar. When you have made your piece as wide as you need it to be, then you'll just tie off onto the warping bar, just a regular square knot. One thing that may help if you need this is to use something like a binder clip to hold the warp thread to the warping bar while you tie the knot. You can see that I have tied off on the warping bar and finished off my warp for the piece without the shedding device. There are a couple more very simple steps before you can begin weaving without the shedding device, but before I show you that, I'm going to show you how to warp for bead weaving with the shedding device. So if you're not going to use the shedding device, you can skip over this part. The pattern and process is almost exactly the same when warping for bead weaving with the shedding device as compared to without. The only difference is when you are placing your warp thread in a dent in the warp coil, you're going to, instead of just placing one, you're going to place two warp threads. So you'll wrap around the loom, place your warp thread in one dent, wrap around the loom, and then place that next warp thread in the same dent. So you will have two warp threads in each dent. That's the only difference. So we've tied to our warping bar just like before, and we're just going to wrap around the loom. And again, just like before, when we hit the warp coil, we're going to place our warp thread in that warp coil. And then when we hit the warping bar, we're going to do a U-turn. So again, the pattern is the same. Now we're coming to our warp coil again, and we are going to now place our warp thread in the same dent that we placed our warp thread just a moment ago. We recommend getting a bottom spring kit, which is just a kit that can add a warp coil to the bottom of your loom when you're warping for bead weaving with a shedding device, because it helps you to organize your warp threads in these pairs a little bit better. So now we're just going to continue wrapping around the loom. When we hit that warping bar, we are going to do a U-turn around it just like before. So now I'm just showing you a close-up of the warp coil at the top of the loom. I have 3 pairs, and I'm just going to bring my next warp thread over one more dent. And then when I come around again, I'm going to put that warp thread in the same dent. So you can see we now have 4 pairs. And that's it. I've tied off my warp on this piece onto the warping bar, and now what we're going to do is we're going to take our spring bar right here and place it in the warp coil at the top of the loom on top of the warp threads. What this will do is prevent the warp threads from popping out during the next step. Now we're going to swing out our wooden clips to release the warping bar, and then slowly move the warping bar down the loom until you're a couple inches from the bottom. Now if this is difficult to do, you can loosen your tension by turning the wing nuts on either side of the loom. Now I'm just going to tighten that tension up a little bit now that the bar is down there. The most important thing to keep in mind when warping for bead weaving with a shedding device is that it's very important to keep your warp threads organized both in pairs, because if you remember, you have 2 warp threads in each dent in the warp coil, and also keep the warp threads separated with a left warp of that pair and a right warp of that pair. You'll see in a little while why that's important. One trick to helping to keep your warp threads organized is to take a needle and thread and weave through at the top of your piece closer to the warp coil, under, over the pairs of warp threads, and then loop around one bar of the loom, come back through, then weave over, under the opposite pairs, then come through, loop around the other bar, and tie to one side, and then bring that whole piece down to the bottom of the loom. And this just helps keep those pairs separated. If you're warping with a bottom spring kit, you don't need to do this. Now we're ready to put our shedding device on our loom. The first thing that we need to do is take our clips and move them so they are facing forward on the loom. So the long part should be facing forward. We'll do this with both clips. Again, you want to make sure that your clips are even. The next thing we'll do is turn the wing nuts on the clips slightly so you can move the little brass circle on top of the clips out of the way. Now we're going to place our shedding device into the indentations in the clips. You'll notice that there's a hole on one side of the shedding device. This is where the shedding device handle will go. If you're right-handed, you want this on the right side of the loom when you're facing the loom, and if you're left-handed, you want it on the left side of the loom when you're facing the loom. So now we'll just place that shedding device right in there. And we're just going to move those brass pieces and tighten them once again so the shedding device is held onto the clips. Now we are going to actually remove our spring bar from the warp coil. We're going to take this and we're going to weave it through our warp threads at the top of the loom. We're not going to weave it through the pairs. So we'll go over one warp thread and then under one, and then over one, and then under one. I've woven my bar over and under every warp thread, and I've just sort of pushed it up to the top of the loom. You can tie it on either side of the bar if your bar is falling down. And what this has done is it has put one warp thread from every pair above the spring bar right there. Those are the warps that are going to get Hetals. So now we are going to take our Allen wrench and we are just going to loosen the screw slightly on the shedding device so we can move this bar out of the way. Then we are going to take our Hetals. Hetals can either be bought from us or you can make them yourself. If you're doing bead weaving with very small beads, we recommend making your own Hetals with whatever beading thread you're using. This is what a Hetal looks like. So it's just a loop that is a certain size. And all we're going to do is we're going to take this Hetal, we're going to put it behind one warp thread, and then we're going to bring the ends together and loop that over the bar. So we're going to take our first warp thread that is raised, so that is on top of that bar right there. We're going to bring our Hetal behind that. Now we've brought those ends together and we're just going to bring it through the bar like that. Very simple. Now I'm showing a close-up of doing the same thing with the next warp thread over. So I have placed my Hetal behind the next raised warp thread over, and I'm just going to bring the ends of that Hetal together, and I am going to loop it over the bar, just like that. And I will continue to do this. One trick is to use a crochet hook to pick up your warp threads if it's difficult to do with your fingers. So as you put your Hetals on, you can move the bar along the shedding device there. If you're new to warping for bead weaving with the shedding device, I highly recommend starting with a very thin piece to get used to the process. So now I'm just showing you from another angle. We have our Hetal behind our next warp thread. We're going to bring the two ends of that together and we're going to loop it right there on the bar. And now we just have one more. So again, our Hetal is behind our warp thread. We bring the ends together and we put it right there on the bar. And now we are actually done with that first set of Hetals. Another thing you want to keep in mind when you're doing this is just be very, very careful to make sure your Hetals are neatly organized. You don't want them messy because there are a lot more ways that you can make a mistake when they are. So now we are going to reinsert the bar. We want to make sure that this is even on both sides, and then we will tighten that screw again with our Allen wrench. Now what we're going to do, this part's really fun, is we're going to turn the shedding device towards the loom, so inwards towards the loom. So the next bar that's empty is on the top. And now we're going to do the same thing that we just did. So we're going to bring our bar over. Now, one thing to note, if you're weaving a wider piece or a piece that is warped in front of one of these little pieces on the loom, you're going to have to either decide if you want your hetals to go on the left or the right of that piece, and you can also bring a hetal with one side of the hetal on one side of the piece and one side of the hetal on the other side of the piece. So keep that in mind for putting hetals on for wider pieces. So the thing that you need to remember when you're putting on your second set of hetals is that every warp thread needs to be brought to the right of the warp thread that already has a hetal. So we still have all of our warp threads that are above the spring bar right here. What we're going to do, and this is another place where a crochet hook would really come in handy, is we're going to take the first warp thread that doesn't have a hetal on it, so it'll be behind that spring bar, and we're going to bring it and make sure it is to the right of the warp thread that already has a hetal on it. So now that we have the correct warp thread picked up, so again, this is the first warp thread from behind the spring bar that does not have a hetal on it, and we've taken that warp thread and brought it to the right of the warp thread that does have a hetal on it. So the first warp thread was the first warp in one pair, and this warp thread that's going on this bar is the second warp thread in that pair. So basically what we're doing is we're taking these pairs of warp threads and we're attaching one from each pair on the bottom and the other from the pair on the top. So now we're just going to do the same thing that we did before. We're going to take our hetal, place it behind our warp thread, and then loop that over the bar. And we'll just continue doing that. So now we're on to our second pair. This first warp thread we had already put a hetal on, and then we're just going to reach back and find that second warp thread in the pair, and we will put a hetal on it just like we did before. So now I am putting my last hetal on. Again, I have a pair of hetals, the one that is in front of this spring bar that we wove through at the very beginning had a hetal and was connected to the bottom of the shedding device. And now we are connecting the other thread in that pair to the top of the shedding device. We found that warp thread and we made sure it was to the right of the warp thread that's on the bottom in its pair. And now we're just going to put the hetal on the bar, just like that. So again, we have pairs of warp threads, one warp thread from each pair is connected to the bottom of the shedding device, and the other warp thread from each pair is connected to the top of the shedding device. When you connect the second set of warp threads, you will make sure to bring that warp thread to the right of the warp thread that already got a hetal. Now we are done putting the hetals on our loom. We're going to replace the bar just like we did before and tighten it with our Allen wrench. There we go. Now, at this point, and also as you are putting hetals on, what you can do is turn your shedding device like this to check that you've been lowering and raising your warp threads correctly, that you put the right hetals on the right warp threads. That's a good way to check. Now we're going to take our spring bar, we'll remove it from the piece and we'll just put it back there in the warp coil. And the last thing that we're going to do is take our shedding device handle and we'll put it in the hole on the shedding device. We just stick it through there and then we put the little nut, screw that right on, and now when we move the shedding device in one direction, we're going to lift up half of our warp threads, and when we move it in the other direction, we're going to lift up the other half. There we go. Make sure that your tension is tight enough on your loom before you begin weaving. You can tighten your tension, again, by turning the wing nuts. You want the tension kind of tight enough that you can strum it a little bit like a guitar. If they're really loose, you're going to have a lot of trouble. Now, another little troubleshooting tip is that if you start weaving and you find, or even if you just change your shed and find that one of your warp threads is not raising correctly, look at your hetals here and make sure that no hetal is crossing over the one next to it. You want your hetals to be very well organized and straight and not crossing. So check on both sides to make sure that they are perfect. Another thing to keep in mind, especially if you're doing a wider piece, is that for the first few rows, you may find that your warp threads are kind of getting caught up on each other a little bit. So after you weave each row, you might want to kind of strum the warp threads and just make sure that everything is organized correctly so it is moving smoothly. But after a few rows, you'll likely find that everything works itself out. Now you're ready to get started weaving.